Good evening. Hi, I'm Dick Deming. I'm the medical director of MercyOne Cancer Center and founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. Welcome to our cancer education series, a collaborative presentation from Above and Beyond Cancer and MercyOne Cancer Center, brought to you all in part from a grant from the Iowa Cancer Consortium. And we're in for a treat tonight. I've got my friend Matthew Reznicek, professor of English at Creighton University. And we had a chance to spend some time together earlier this year, Matthew. Matthew grew up in Texas, and he got his bachelor's degree at Creighton, and then he went overseas to Ireland, where at Queen's College in Belfast, he got his master's and his PhD in 19th-century British and Irish literature. So welcome, Matthew. And Matthew and I connected because Creighton University School of Medicine recently revamped their entire education. So many of you might know I'm a graduate of Creighton Medical School. And, you know, I think back when I was in medical school in the 1980s, up through just a couple of years ago, the model for medical education hadn't really changed. It was okay, you've already been to college, you've done all the humanity electives, we're just gonna hammer some more science into you, and for the first 2 years, you're just in great big classrooms, learning all your biology and pharmacology and physiology and biochemistry and everything, and then the third and fourth years, you get to see patients. Well, Creighton University revamped and really believes that the practice of medicine is a human being taking care of another human being, and that involves the humanities. So they actually have brought humanities back into medical school, and including the humanities teachers, many who teach in the undergraduate world have been brought into the medical school to teach humanities, and Matthew is part of that program. So before we get started with your talk, maybe what was your first thought when who first approached you and about teaching literature to first-year medical students?
So I was first approached by Jim Smith, who's an OBGYN in Creighton School of Medicine and is also the chair of the medical education department. And he had this wild idea about teaching the works of Charles Dickens to first-year medical students. Jim, for years, had been interested in Dickens and especially kind of interested in Dickens's representation of illnesses, but also his involvement with public health campaigns like vaccination campaigns and public sanitation campaigns. And so Jim and I started getting coffee, and we started talking about these courses that we could do and what it would mean for medical students to have a more robust education that dealt with kind of the humanities and brought these sorts of skills back to their education. You know, for the longest time, students who earned their medical degrees didn't specialize in medicine early on. They got their degrees from the University of Edinburgh or University of Glasgow or Oxford or Cambridge, and were taking Latin and Greek and moral philosophy. And so this is in many ways a return to the tradition of classical medical education. And it's the argument that Jim and I often talk about is that reading a Dickens novel is a lot like having a conversation with a patient, where the information may or may not feel relevant, but it all becomes important, and you sift through the various levels of social relations and the background details that end up mattering quite a bit, despite their initial sort of perception of irrelevance. So all the details matter, and reading Victorian fiction is a lot more like a clinical visit than I think that certainly the M1s, or especially the undergraduate students, might be willing to admit at first.
You know, and when I think back to, I actually took a semester of Dickens in college, and now that you mention it, you think back in the novels are you know, the whole social determinants of health, which
Exactly.
we didn't use that phrase back in the 1970s. But when you look at how poverty and industrialization and lack of organized medical care and access to care and all of those, how they affected health. So we'll touch a little bit on that, but we're going to talk about tonight the reading for health is the title. So we know that there are many activities that we can do in life that improve our health, besides going to the doctor and getting a prescription and going to the drugstore and taking a pill. And this cancer education series, we've touched on many different things that we know improves health, from physical activity to mindfulness meditation to creative activities such as writing, journaling, art. And what we're going to talk about tonight isn't so much the health benefit of writing literature, but the health benefit, improvement in quality of life of reading literature. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Matthew, because I think you have, and I'm going to bring up your slides. So Matthew's going to give a little bit of a presentation, and then I'm going to come back in and we're going to have a conversation about reading to improve health. So there, I brought up your slideshow, Matthew, so I'll turn it over to you.
Well, great. And so thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for the conversation. And more than anything, I think what we're going to talk a little bit about is not simply the way that literature can be beneficial for human beings, but especially the way it can be beneficial for people who provide care, whether clinicians or general practitioners. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the way that literature can help create a greater sense of connection to patients. So in 2016, I brought this article that talks about the way that medicine tends to view success through sort of mechanistic terms and commercial terms. It looks at progress and evidence-based medicine that often risks a view of patients solely as objects of intellectual interests. Healthcare professionals may distance themselves from patients, avoiding emotions and focusing on biomedical facts, a process described as existential neglect. And I think a lot of us kind of resonate with this. We have left doctor's offices or clinical visits feeling as though we weren't really seen or taken seriously, that we troubled the physician with more questions than they had time for. And there's a question about the way in which medicine can encourage the loss of empathy or sympathy or compassion for patients in order to simply get through more patients, to see as many as possible, to fix as many problems as possible, all of which come from places of benevolence and altruism, but certainly can help lead or can have patients being left feeling ignored or uncared for. And so I want to talk a little bit about what care means and what sympathy means. In her recent book, Talia Schaefer argues that care is meeting another's need. Care is a theory through which we can register that someone needs help and then assess how well someone meets that need. Instead of wondering precisely what afflicts the characters and trying to diagnose them, we turn our attention instead to what it is that they need in that moment and how are we responding to that need. So I want to keep in mind that idea of meeting someone else's need. And that may not always be biophysiological or may not simply be biophysiological. And of course, Talia Schaefer, being a scholar of Victorian literature, connects more broadly to an ancient, well, not ancient, but an 18th century theory of sympathy. And I know today sympathy is sort of aligned with ideas of condescension or pity, but it's only until the 20th century that we begin to differentiate between sympathy and empathy. So for the majority of human history, sympathy meant the same thing as empathy. And one of the greatest theorists of sympathy is Adam Smith. So the Scottish philosopher most famous today for the theory of for the wealth of nations and the image of the invisible hand also theorized this concept of sympathy. And he argues that man, however selfish he is actually interested in the fortune of others, and that the fortune of others renders their happiness necessary to our own happiness. Of this kind is pity or compassion, he writes, the emotion which we feel for the misery of others when either we see it or are made to conceive it in a very lively manner. As we have no immediate experience, he argues, of what other men feel, we can form no idea of the manner in which they are affected, but by conceiving what we ourselves should feel in the like situation. It's only by imagination that we put ourselves in a position to feel what someone else is experiencing. And so this is one of my arguments that I want to kind of make to you, is that literature produces a better sense of sympathy, of empathy, and thus of care, because it allows us to imagine ourselves in the position of someone else. And in so doing, we are able to understand and respond to pain and suffering and their needs more readily. I want to start a little bit with Jane Austen. And Jane Austen is, to me, one of the greatest writers in the English language. Everyone is aware, at least, of Pride and Prejudice. You know, there are many hot takes on whether Colin Firth or Matthew McFadden is a better Mr. Darcy. Everyone who's read Austen has a very favorite Austen. And in every one of her novels, from Sense and Sensibility to Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, deals to some extent with illness and suffering. In the famous ending of Persuasion, Captain Wentworth says, the quote on the screen, "I'm half agony and half hope." And by the end of the novel, we put ourselves in Captain Wentworth's position, and we're able to feel both his agony and his hope. But in a novel like Emma, where Mr. Woodhouse is so afraid of falling sick, of falling ill, where Mrs. Bates and Jane Fairfax both fall ill throughout the novel, there's a constant awareness in Austen of the threat that illness poses. And especially in Emma, but I think also in Persuasion, there's an awareness of our need to respond appropriately. Austen believes not simply in sympathy, but in responding to those situations that produce sympathy. Persuasion famously has this scene where a character jumps off of a quay or a dock and ends up breaking her head open from the fall. And the characters respond with great empathy, and there's this immediate kind of breaking into action to take care of her. And in Emma's perhaps the most famous example of a lack of sympathy. Mr. Knightley chides Emma for not taking care to respond appropriately. And that moment where Mr. Emma kind of remonstrates Emma, where Mr. Knightley remonstrates Emma, kind of functions as a turning point in the novel, where she begins to think differently about her behavior towards others and what she ought to do when other people are unwell, when other people are suffering. And so Austen kind of creates this sort of base where, through the series of representations of illness, but more of suffering, we're taught that we need to respond compassionately, that we need to take care of the other person around us, that our duty belongs to other people. And I argue that this is a really great thing to talk to medical students about, and especially to talk to clinicians about, that it's not simply the physical symptoms of agony or hope that you're responding to, it's the emotional elements that help people feel taken care of. The next example, Charles Dickens, is as Dr. Deming said, kind of perfect. So many of Dickens's novels involve illnesses. They involve the social determinants of health, those aspects of our identities, race, gender, class, ability, geography, that shape our predisposition to illnesses, toward health, the way that we experience health and health care. And so what I've got on the screen is from the first chapter of Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist. And this is right after Oliver is born, and in so many of Dickens's novels, there's this focus on childbirth and what that means. But in Oliver Twist, Oliver is born to a woman who is found in the street. So the presumption is that she's a prostitute and thus not really deserving of care, or at least of good care. She's brought to the workhouse and is cared for by a surgeon who is busy drinking gin and a nurse who's busy drinking wine. And as she begins to die, she says, "Let me see the child." And the surgeon had been sitting with his face turned towards the fire, giving the palms of his hands a warm and a rub. But as the young woman spoke, he rose and, advancing to the bed's head, said with more kindness than might have been expected, "Oh, you must not talk about dying yet." And this is the one moment early in the novel that we begin to see a sense of compassion or a sense of sympathy, a sense of care. Despite the fact that Oliver is already situated in a position that makes clear the failures of health and the failures of healthcare, the inequalities that define Victorian illnesses and Victorian social life. You get this one moment where the novel says, "No, you must not leave it at that. You have to respond with more kindness than might be expected." And so it challenges us to think, especially for the people we think are least deserving of care, what are we called? How are we called to respond to them? How are we called to do more than might be expected of them? And then the last one, I think, is one that I cannot recommend enough. In Elizabeth Gaskell's novel, North and South, which is about the movement of a family from the rural world of Jane Austen of Southwest England up to the north of England, a fictional representation of Manchester. There are at least 5 deaths in the novel, all of which are attributed to the industrial conditions of the city. So it's fairly accurate to think about Milton in the novel as somewhere like Detroit or Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And all these environmental conditions produce this real sense of inequality. But it also shows the fact that conditions of bad health, of bad governance, of bad industrial development impact you regardless of class. So whether or not you're wealthy or poor, you will be negatively affected, but it affects the poor to a greater extent. And the quote that's up on the screen, I think, gets to this most clearly. And this is a young woman about 19 years old who spent all her life working in a cotton mill. And of course, the novel is published before the American Civil War, so the cotton is coming from America, produced by people who are enslaved. And there's a connection between that sense of enslavement. And as she's dying, Bessie Higgins begins to wonder about the role of religion and whether or not it's right to think about something better in the hereafter. And she says, "When I'm in a fever, half asleep and half awake, it comes back. Doubt comes back upon me. And I think, if this should be the end of all, and if all I've been born for is just to work my heart and my life away, and to sicken in this dreary place, with the mill noises in my ears forever until I could scream out for them to stop and let me have a little piece of quiet, and with the fluff, the cotton filling my lungs until I thirst to death for one long, deep breath of the clear air you speak of. And my mother gone, and I never able to tell her again how I loved her, and oh, all my troubles. And I think if this life is the end, that there's no God to wipe away all the tears from all eyes. So I just worked on till I shall never get out the whirl out of my ears, or the fluff out of my throat in this world. And that's all. This is sort of a plaintive plea for someone to care that her life is defined by illness and suffering. And it's a reminder, I think, to students, to medical students especially, but also to clinical practitioners, that there's something remarkably human about just listening to other people tell you how much pain they're in. And that simple act of listening begins a sort of a process of care, of response. Because listening itself is an action, and it asks us to think about not only whose voices we hear, but what our response ought to be once we hear it. And so I want to kind of wrap up briefly with one more quote from Schaeffer. And this, I think, reminds us, just as characters in Dickens's novels or characters in Austen's novels show the sort of the social network. And just as our providers and our patients are wrapped up together, Schaeffer argues that every one of us is alive because others care for us. From our helpless infancy onward, and that every one of us reaches out to help others in ways as large as parenting or as small as greeting a crossing guard. And meshed as we are in networks of obligation, gratitude, and assistance, we need to recognize our own profound social ties. None of us are autonomous. Our very selfhood is intermeshed with others. And I think that means ultimately, like Emma Woodhouse, like Oliver Twist, like Anne Elliot, like so many characters in 19th century fiction and so many people we know today, not simply that we are intermeshed with others, but that we depend upon helping others. We both need help and we crave the capacity to help. So reading, ultimately in the end, reading these 19th century novels, thinking about the representation of care, of illness and health, reminds us that at the very end, we depend on each other and we look to each other to help care for ourselves and for the world around us.
Wow. Hey, thank you, Matthew. By the way, there's so many things that you said that make me think of things. So let me just start with that last slide that you had with the quotation about, being a human being in a civilization requires that we care for each other. There's a story about Margaret Mead. She was asked by one of her anthropology students, what was the first sign of civilization you found in a dig? And the student thought she was going to talk about finding a clay pot or finding a fish hook or something, and she said it was finding a human femur that had been broken and then healed. And that in the animal world, if you break a femur, I mean, you're dead meat. You cannot get food for yourself. You cannot get water. You cannot take care of yourself. A broken femur in the animal world results in death. But finding a human femur that had been broken and then healed was a sign that somebody cared for this human being that had broken a femur, had protected them, had nursed them back to health, had fed and watered them, and that this was a first sign of civilization is clear evidence of a human being helping someone who is weaker and more frail. So that's one thing. And then the second, you started off with Adam Smith, and you're right, the invisible hand, we think of him not so, or I think of him as sort of, kind of the father of economics and of consumerism and, the capital economy where everything sort of works out with cost and benefit. But in reality, we all live our lives doing so many things that aren't just about our pocketbook. We all do things that benefit others to the detriment of our pocketbook in the short way. And so that one quote that you had there, that it can't be looked on as just supply and demand in a consumer-driven capitalist society, that we do things for the greater good, and that's part of the invisible hand and the economics.
Yeah. And so Adam Smith, I think, is such a complex figure, and I think it says a lot about who we are as a society that we remember the invisible hand more than we remember the impartial spectator. So he famously was a professor of moral philosophy and not an economist, and thought that you had to teach these two books together. And in his lifetime, and in the wake of his death, the moral philosophy was more important and more famous than the economics. And he argued that ultimately it is only by being able to put yourself in someone else's position that you develop ethics. And by thinking about how you would feel in the position that someone else is experiencing, you begin to think through your relationship to other people and to society and your duty to care.
Yeah. So let me run something by you, and this, I'm just interested in your thoughts, because some of what I say may not be accurate in the English and the historical. But I was climbing Mount Kilimanjaro with a patient of mine, a Catholic priest, and we were sort of riffing on one afternoon as we were hiking the relationship between suffering and compassion. And as part of our conversation, he said, well, hey, doc, if you spoke Latin, you wouldn't be amazed that there's this relationship, that in Latin, the word for suffering is passion, as in the passion of Christ. And right there in Latin, with the word compassion, literally means with one's suffering. And so I've always thought, the idea that suffering, going through suffering, allows us to recognize suffering, not just in ourselves, but having suffered, it allows us to recognize suffering in others, and not just to recognize it, but to be with suffering in an attempt to relieve suffering.
Yes, entirely. And there's something really interesting about the way in which in disability theory, there's an argument that we are only ever temporarily fully abled. At one point in our life, we will all be disabled, whether it's through old age or an injury or whatever. At one point in your life, you will experience what we recognize as disability. And once you reframe it that way, that your health, your fully abled body, is only temporarily fully abled, you begin to think through the ways in which your health is contingent, and we are always close to experiencing the need for other people. And I think it raises our awareness of suffering amongst other people and our own sort of ability to overlook it. And as soon as you begin to think about all the ways that you yourself are in relationship or in potential relationship to kind of concepts of illness or pain or suffering, The pandemic's been a really wonderful experience for thinking about the degree to which we depend upon other people, and often through unknown relationships, right? Like, so if the rate of infection and is one infected person can infect 3 other people, it doesn't mean it has to be someone in your household. It can be someone in the line at Starbucks or someone on the bus. And so it shows the degree to which our sense of health is interconnected and our health is dependent upon other people. And I think that that really reminds us that despite the myths of self-sufficiency and self-reliance, we do all depend on each other for help and for the maintenance of health and for the recovery of health, whatever that might look like.
Yeah, and as you pointed out at the beginning of life, we don't call an infant disabled, but seriously, it requires so much care and attention. And although, yes, it's stressful for a parent, I mean, most parents don't feel like, oh my gosh, this child is such a burden. Um, as we approach the end of life, when we have gone from being cared for as infants, and then we get to the end of life when we have to be cared for again, our perspective is like, I don't want to be a burden to my family. And in many cases, you'll see a very, very loving family that also doesn't feel burdened by being able to provide love and support. Um, let me change just a little bit to stick with the literature theme, because obviously reading a work of fiction, you're reading a narrative, and I'm sure you are very familiar with the concept of narrative medicine. So the studies have shown that when a doctor walks into a room with a patient and the encounter and exchange begins, that typically the patient gets to speak for about 23 seconds before the patient is interrupted. The concept of narrative medicine, which is certainly um, enhanced and is encouraged by literature, is not just sitting by and listening, but actively listening and letting the patient tell their story. This morning, I met a wonderful woman, was born in the 1930s. I knew I was going to be seeing her because she's just been diagnosed with pancreas cancer, not a diagnosis that has usually a favorable outcome. And that I was going to be, she's already seen the surgeon and the medical oncologist, and we've already seen the x-rays and the scans and the pathology. She is 89 years old and spoke with a bit of an accent. And so it's like, before we get anywhere to talk about your x-rays, to look at your scans, tell me about yourself. Where are you from? And she lit up and told me the most magnificent story of having grown up in Latvia and at the beginning of World War II being displaced to Germany, and then in 1951 coming to the United States. But a very long story of what their family did in Latvia and how they lived in Germany, and the brothers and sisters and coming over. And then we started talking about, what brings you joy? Because eventually we're going to start talking about how to manage likely an incurable disease, where the path could include treatment that has lots of side effects and could alter one's quality of life, and have a concept about what brings joy into one's life, and how much do we want to optimize life expectancy at the cost of diminishing quality of life. So the whole listening to her story not only brought me joy, but brought her tremendous joy in the midst of a conversation that was really going to be about mortality and finding a path.
Well, and so interesting. There's nothing more humanizing than being asked to tell your story. In the Irish language, one of the greetings is Cén Scéal, and in Irish it translates to "What's your story?" And so in Hiberno English, you'll often hear people in Dublin, for example, say sort of, "What's the story?" as a just a casual greeting. And it's always struck me as this really sort of humane aspect of Irish culture, of Irish history, that if nothing else, you can bring your story as a gift. You are capable of telling your story as a contribution. And there are kind of multiple knock-on effects of that, right? One of which is the French philosopher Jacques Rancière argues that the distinction between the human and the non-human is the individual whose speech is recognized as speech. So whose voice do we hear as speech, and whose voice do we hear as mere utterance? So what stories do we value? What voices do we value? Creates this really important narrative about who we are and how we experience the world, and in what worlds we're participants. And there's the other side of that, and I think your beginning comment about, patients get 23 seconds, which is less than a shot clock in the NBA, right? You get it raises the balance, and this is something we talk to medical students about quite a bit. The difference between the concept of listening skeptically, so sort of verifying, like, is the patient telling the whole story? Do I trust that their symptoms actually reveal what they're telling me they think they have? There's an inherent sort of skepticism in the clinical conversation, but that has to be balanced with what Rita Sharon talks about as an ethic of compassion. So are you listening compassionately even as you're listening skeptically? And how do you achieve that balance?
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit more about this hierarchy, and thank you for pointing out that sometimes words change their meaning depending on when they were used, and so I don't want to make too much, as you pointed out, the word sympathy. But so here today in the 21st century, I kind of think of a hierarchy of feelings toward someone that is going through some difficulty. So maybe you can come up with some other words, but the hierarchy I sort of think of is pity, which clearly in the 21st century is a word that is patronizing and places you above, and maybe even implies that the person who is suffering had something to do with it themselves. And then I think of sympathy as a sort of feeling sorry, but maybe in a more detached way. And then the next level, I might put empathy, where you actually are trying to, through creativity, imagination, and through your own personal experience of feel what they're feeling, understand, try to deeply put yourself in their position. And then I would put at the top compassion, which is not just empathy, but to attempt to relieve suffering. The Dalai Lama has a story where you're climbing a mountain in the Himalayas and you come across a guy on the trail where a rock has come down and it's laying on his leg, and empathy is getting down on the ground with him and trying to feel what he's feeling, and compassion is moving the rock off of his leg. So there's this action involved. Are there other words besides that you would add to this hierarchy of pity, sympathy, empathy, compassion, and what's your do you ever talk about the difference in these emotions and how, as you're teaching a medical student, as you are reading a piece of literature, how to emulate more the compassion as opposed to the pity?
Totally. And I think your distinction is really spot on. And it's not simply the degree to which you're able to identify with the person suffering. More than anything, it necessitates a response. So even I think above compassion, I would put something like justice or equity. No, because once you begin to respond, there are questions about, is your response achieving not just a good outcome, but an outcome that rectifies the situation that produced suffering in the first place. There's a famous sort of metaphor in The Social Determinants of Health that talks about dealing with medicine, dealing with symptoms is pulling people out of the river. Health justice, and especially concern with the social determinants of health, is asking what's pushing them in the river in the first place. And compassion, I think, is that pulling people out of the river. But there needs to be a question about equity or justice or systemic responses that asks what's pushing these people into the river, what's causing these rocks to fall in the first place. So that's the only, to me, that's the only level of hierarchy I would add.
Okay. Let's talk some more about literature and reading. So maybe a personal question. What's the first book of significance you remember reading? I don't know whether you can remember fifth grade or whether it was junior high or high school. And when you realized that this was something so important that eventually it became your career, but where it became something that you truly understood was significant.
So first and second grade, I was in this Jack London phase. I adored Jack London. And to the point where like I read Call of the Wild and White Fang and all these stories about wolves and wild dogs. And I thought that I wanted to be a wolf biologist. And it was only when I started taking science, in fourth and fifth grade, that I was like, no, I don't. What I enjoy is the books about it, and that's not the science.
Okay.
But for me, it was very early on that I began to think about. My parents are very fond of telling a story where I wrote something before I could actually write words, and I made them like sit there and read this thing that I had written, but it wasn't actually a language. It was so the relationship with literature goes back very, very deep.
Okay, and then a couple more questions. What would be a book that you would recommend to a patient who's just been diagnosed with cancer, a work of literature that might have relevant themes of mortality, hope, agency, whatever you think are important. And then I'll give you, while you're answering that, your other half of your brain can be thinking about the next question. What would be a piece of literature you'd recommend to a medical student to maybe get them in the right place to be the type of doctor you think is the doctor that we need for the 21st century?
So the patient one, there's this beautiful novel from 1942 called The Land of Spices by Kate O'Brien. And this is one of those books that changed my life. And it's about this young girl who goes to school. So she's sent to boarding school in a fictional version of the city of Limerick. And it's the twin story of Anna Murphy as she grows up from a child to applying for university, with the story of the Reverend Mother, the nun who's in charge of this school, who sees the child growing up, but also recounts the death of her father, the death of her mentor, who's the Mother Superior of the order. And it's this beautiful sort of negotiation of lives that have touched you and that are fading or have passed, and what your obligation is to those who are left behind. How do you nurture? How do you help people heal? And in so doing, how do you heal yourself is one of the central questions of the Land of Spices. And it's outstanding.
Okay, I've written that down. I wasn't familiar with that.
It's
So now,
it's criminally neglected.
okay.
And then one for the medical students, right? This was I'm going to resist giving a novel that's explicitly about a doctor because I think that's kind of obvious.
Mhm.
But I actually think you'd be hard pressed to think about a better novel that deals with caring and the complexities of care than Jane Austen's Persuasion. And Persuasion is really important because it points not just to Anne Elliot as this outstanding carer, but for the majority of the novel, she is overlooked and disregarded. And so it points to the stress of caring and the burnout that can happen by people who are defined as carers. And despite that, she's able to find compassion in the relationships that sustain her and in the caring that she provides. She's able to kind of think through and find a sense of self that is both tied up with caring and independent of that specific act. So I think one of the main things that medical students are afraid of is burnout, which is entirely understandable. And one of the benefits of reading is that it can provide an antidote to that, but it also gives you a place to think through what is it that I'm experiencing? What are the anxieties that I am experiencing? And I think Anne Elliot is kind of the perfect corollary to the medical experience of the care providers, both physicians and nurses.
Yeah. And you mentioned burnout, and some people talk about compassion fatigue. And so I understand what that is. And, you don't want to quibble with language, but, I don't think that there is a net sum gain of zero in compassion. I mean, it's like a hug. It works in both directions. It's not like, okay, I only have so much compassion and that I've given it up on my at 2 o'clock and I don't have any left for my patients from 2 to 5. I just don't think that's the way compassion works. I attended a talk, and even the concept of burnout sort of implies like, I just don't have it anymore. I can't muster the energy to do it. And it's probably not that we can't do it. Another word that sort of rang true, or phrase, was moral injury, that
Mhm.
we can't, in this day and age, with the workforce shortage that we have, and you're up on the floor and there's not enough nurses to do everything, and you want this patient to have their IV pain medicine right now, but only the nurse can do it. I mean, I can't even as a doctor get into the locked cabinet and do it. And you just feel this moral injury, and it's not. If I could work harder and make it better, that's not going to make it better. So just different ways for how do you approach this feeling of inadequacy that may lead to this year of the great retirement, as some people are calling it.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, one of the things I struggle with in my own experience is feeling like I'm being asked to give more and more and more, teach more classes, be more flexible to respond to our students' needs, which is all good. And I think the thing you're pointing to is sort of the structural or systemic issues that don't necessarily respond to the complexities of providing care.
Mm-hmm.
You find yourself sort of butting your head against, I want to be more compassionate, I want to be more flexible, and yet the system is not allowing me to respond in that way. Like there are certain barriers or constructions or externalities, the locked cabinet, that prevent you from meeting the needs to the fullest extent that you want, to the fullest extent of your desires. And that creates a sense of, I think, disempowerment. And repeatedly, a repeated experience of that can lead to a sense of kind of moral crisis. Well, what am I doing if I got into this to do good, and yet I'm not able to do the good that I feel like I ought to be able? So what's the point? And I do think you're right that moral injury is really important. And it seems to come to a large extent from structural concerns that don't take seriously the full complexity of the cared for, but also the carers. The systems have, to be fair, right? Like no one could have predicted the depths of 2020, 2021. But we've been doing this for 20 months, and why are some systems not yet adapting? Why aren't we better at doing X, Y, or Z to enable us to care more fully or more freely?
Yeah, great things to contemplate, and I personally find that reading fiction is not just an endeavor in distraction by storytelling, but it gives you the time to reflect on things, and hopefully allows you greater understanding of yourself and the role that you have.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll end it, Matthew, with in any way you want, maybe reflecting on the medical humanities, the teaching of humanities in medical school, either what it has meant to you or anecdotes about the influence it's had on any of your students, or anything you want to share about your experience teaching medical humanities in medical school.
So let me start with I think the best way to understand the medical humanities for me has been the great privilege of getting to teach pre-health undergraduates, M1s, and then seeing them as M4s as well. So going from pre-medical school to just about to graduate with their MD. Mm-hmm. And the pre-meds and then even the M1s, I think, still conceive of medicine and healthcare as sort of algebraic. They are solving for X, and if they are given enough they can understand the variables and solve the equation. If X, then Y. And there's a conception that medicine is based on a right answer. And by the time they reach M4 year, by the time they begin seeing patients regularly, I think they understand much more that medicine is less a science and more an art. It's an art of compassion and an art of listening and an art of thinking. And at their base, I think the humanities, and especially the medical humanities, are asking us to be compassionate and to listen and to think about the human on both sides of our care.
Beautiful. Yeah, that is wonderful. So I think we're going to end it with that, Matthew. That was great. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I know how busy you are with your classes and how much is asked of you professors at the colleges, universities now. So I really appreciate you taking the time this evening. And thanks to all of you who attended. We've got a live studio audience here, and we also have people watching us live streaming right now. And Matthew, this will go on to two different places. It will go on to the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel for anyone to watch at their leisure. And it will also be on the MercyOne Cancer Center website for people to go to. And Matthew will also share the link of this conversation with you so that you can spread it far and wide to your audience as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure and a real treat.
Well, you are welcome. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for coming. Please join us again next week. I'm Dick Deming, Medical Director of MercyOne Cancer Center and founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. Come join us next week. Thanks. Bye, everybody.